The Falcons finalized their initial 53-man roster. Who made the cut and who didn't?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time. You may know me as Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the Iron that Sharpens the Iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this pod. That means you make it your first watch or first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, of course, today was the deadline for NFL teams to make their cuts for their initial 53-man roster. There will be changes for most teams in the NFL over the next couple of days and weeks leading up to the NFL season. And that probably will also include the Falcons. But let's go through the list of players that the Falcons released today to get down to their initial 53-man players. They cut 22 players, put 3 players on injured reserve, and those cuts were running backs Spencer Brown and Carlos Washington, wide receivers Chris Blair, Dylan Drummond, O.J. Hilaire, Jesse Matthews, tight end John Fitzpatrick, offensive lineman Julian Davenport, Andrew Stuber, Barry Wesley, defensive lineman Prince Emili, Zion Logue, LaCale London, and Tommy Togiai, edge rushers Damone Harris and Kenny Ogini, cornerbacks Natrone Brooks, Anthony Johnson, Kevin King, and Jaden Price, and safeties Dane Cruikshank and Trey Tarpley. They also waived injured Milo Eifler, the linebacker, and safety Josh Thompson, and they placed DeMarco Hellams on short-term IR as we predicted a couple of weeks ago when he suffered that injury in the Dolphins preseason game, and we'll hopefully get an update at some point later this season. You know, the earliest Hellams can come back from that short-term IR is week 5, I believe. He has to miss the first 4 weeks of the season. For those of you not familiar with the term waived injured, that basically means you're cutting a player. If they clear waivers, then they revert to your injured reserve. And we'll see about that because generally speaking, the players at the Falcons waive injured. They tend to not keep those guys on the IR for the entirety of the year. But if you have less than 4 years of experience, you have to go through waivers in that process. So, you know, when it comes to these cuts, not too many surprises. A couple of guys that were like, okay, thought they had a good chance of making the roster, but didn't quite make it. Those are guys like Kevin King and Chris Blair. You know, I think we talked about this a little bit on the podcast. You know, there was a little bit of redundancy with Kevin King and Clark Phillips being reserve corners on the team, and neither one of those guys have a ton of special teams value. And how many of those guys can you really afford to carry? And the Falcons, at least at this point, seemingly are planning on only carrying one. But the thing about Kevin King is because he has 4 or more years left of or more years of NFL experience, he is not subject to waivers, right? So that means he's basically a free agent. And so, you know, if the Falcons sort of have a wink nod sort of thing of like, hey, we're going to cut you, you know, you shop yourself out there for a couple of days and then maybe we'll bring you back ahead of week 1. That is something that they could wind up doing. Chris Blair, I think ultimately, again, special teams is going to be the theme. It matters, as, you know, a certain person might say. And I think ultimately with guys like Casey Washington and Kadero Hodge, and Chris Blair did get, you know, plenty of reps on special teams this preseason, but not necessarily a guy that I think has a, you know, defined role in that regard to justify keeping him on the roster. And that led to, you know, of course, DeAngelo Malone, the player that we've been talking about, you know, since the Ravens game, as a player that was on the bubble. And basically, if he was going to stick on this roster, it was purely going to be because of his value on special teams, not necessarily something that he's bringing to the table as far as defense. We just really haven't seen much from DeAngelo Malone in 3 summers with the Atlanta Falcons and 2 seasons with the Atlanta Falcons as far as defense goes. But he is a high-level special teams player. He's one of the better special teams guys on their team last year. I think I saw the stat that someone said that he led the NFL in special teams tackles in this preseason. So that was a player that if the Falcons cut him, he was probably going to get claimed. And so that may be part of their process, which is to keep him for the next couple of days, hoping that they can sort of stash him, then cut him later, and then he'll be able to clear waivers after other teams have sort of established their practice squads and whatnot. So we'll see on that front if DeAngelo Malone is going to be part of this roster week 1. And as we've been hinting at, there's no guarantee. Just because you're on the 53-man today doesn't mean you're going to be on the 53-man tomorrow, so to speak. And then the other sort of player that was a mild surprise in terms of being retained was Jovaughn Gwyn, right? And this is a case of D-Led. And no, we're not talking about D. Orlando Ledbetter. We're talking about Dwayne Ledford, the Falcons offensive line coach. We talked about when we drafted Jovaughn Gwyn 2 years ago in the 7th round that he was a guy that Dwayne Ledford, when he was a college coach, tried to recruit to, I think, NC State at that time when he was still there. And this is kind of his pet project. We talked about this with Corey Woodruff for the win on yesterday's episode, making our predictions on the cuts, and talked about Jovaughn Gwyn. And I think I left that in that episode. I had to edit out about 10 minutes of that podcast. And so I think that wasn't on the cutting room floor. But we talked a little bit about Jovaughn Gwyn and how he was okay, right? Like, didn't do really anything to earn a roster spot. Was probably the team's 9th or 10th or maybe even 11th best offensive lineman in camp this summer, or at least based off of his performance in the preseason. Does give you some depth as a center guard, but hasn't done anything in 2 summers that makes you think he's going to move past Ryan Newsel on the depth chart at any point in the future. And so, D-Led doing a solid for, the other D-Led and keeping him around and seeing maybe, 3 years of jump. As we often know with offensive linemen, it's usually the 3rd year where guys are going to really make a jump. And, in the case of Jovaughn Gwyn, not necessarily making a jump to be a starter. It's, making a jump to being like, oh, that's a good backup in the ways that Ryan Newsel is. So those are kind of the big surprises. Of course, Taylor Heinicke did stick on the roster. There was a question about that. As I've said on previous episodes, I thought there was more likely than not that Taylor Heinicke would be kept as that 3rd quarterback, and it gives the Falcons an opportunity to hold on to his services. And I do think this was retained in the episode with Corey yesterday. Again, I don't remember exactly what I edited out of that show, but we talked about how, it's probably more valuable to the Falcons to hold on to Taylor Heinicke and maybe use him as future trade bait than necessarily cutting him and, having to bring in a brand new quarterback to run the scout team that doesn't really know the offense, and all those various things. And as we saw with Nathan Rourke and John Paddock, it wasn't as if the Falcons, stumbled onto some, hidden treasure with the other options that they had at the quarterback position. As much as many people, despise Taylor Heinicke, and I certainly am not a huge fan of his play style, which is just basically, just go out there and sling it like a gunslinger. But, usually those guys that do that at a high level typically have a little bit more arm talent than Taylor Heinicke does. But like, he is better than the alternative options, right? He has NFL starting, 32 career starts or something like that under his belt, and certainly gives you a decent insurance policy, especially given that your top 2 quarterbacks in Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix, and we're hoping for the best with those guys, but they do have some recent injury history, so there's no guarantee that either one of those guys will make it through this season fully healthy. So having a competent 3rd quarterback, especially for a team that is in a quote unquote win now and needs to kind of win and make the playoffs, and Taylor Heinicke's going to probably do that better than sort of any alternative option out there on the market, unless you want to go back and revisit the Desmond Ridder thing because he got cut by the Cardinals today. So those are your options, and so whatever you think on that front. But we will continue today's Locked On Falcons talking about what's next. What are the sort of logistics over the next few days, and sort of what can we realistically expect for this team to do? How proactive will they be on the waiver wire as we continue today's Locked On Falcons? It is summertime, and well, summertime's really coming to a close, and that means, it's the perfect time to get back in the stadium, and Game Time is going to help you do that. All you got to do is download the app and head on over and see what's available for you. You guys are looking to get back into Mercedes-Benz Stadium. You have an opportunity this weekend to watch Georgia beat the brakes off of Clemson. Sorry to all my Clemson fans out there, because I know there's a sizable amount of Falcon fans that are also Clemson fans, but you know what's going to happen, right? Or you can wait and get back into the stadium when the Falcons take on the Steelers in week 1. And of course, all you got to do is check out the app, see what the prices are. They're not cheap, right? But Game Time is going to do the best they can to allow you to have a worthwhile experience and spend as little money as you possibly can, because they're going to give you all the information that you need up front so that you can make an informed purchase, like their seat views, their panoramic seat views, right? They got flash deals, all in prices, so you don't have to get hit by hidden fees at checkout. All you got to do is download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll get $20 off your first purchase, whether that first purchase is buying football tickets, baseball tickets, comedy, music theater, whatever event is near you. Just download that Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL. Terms apply, and that code is LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So what is next? What is this process that we're going to have to go through in these next couple of days? Because I know some of you guys are like disappointed that your guys or your guy got cut today, and sort of, can we bring him back? What's next? All that sort of thing. So basically now that, 4:00 Tuesday has passed, the next deadline is the 12 p.m. Eastern time Wednesday. That's the time that teams have to put in their waiver claims. And then the NFL will decide, sort of based off of who put in their claims, who gets priority to pick up those guys. For those of you not familiar with waivers, kind of sort of already touched around it, but basically every player that is released that has less than 4 years of NFL experience is subject to waivers. That means basically they get cut. Other teams can say, we want that guy. And if they want that guy, they can get that guy. And they will basically take on whatever his contract is. And that will be brought in to their fold. But if multiple teams put in a waiver claim, then it's based off of a waiver claim order. And at this point in time, that's based off of last year's finish. So it's essentially draft order. So the Falcons in this case, are 8th in the waiver claim order. So if, say, the Kansas City Chiefs and the Falcons want the same players and they both put in a waiver claim, the Falcons will get that player. But if, say, the Panthers and the Falcons want the same player, because the Panthers are at the top of the waiver claim order because they would have had the number 1 pick based off of last year's record, the Panthers will get that sort of player. And then after week 3 of this upcoming season, then the waiver claim order adjusts, not from the previous year's standings, but from the current year's standings. So starting in week 4, it will be based off of the current year's standings that will indicate who has waiver claims if teams are making waiver claims in season and whatnot. And then once 12 o'clock hits on Wednesday, then teams can establish their practice squads, 16 players, up to 16 players on your practice squad. I believe because the Falcons have an international player in Kenny Ogini, they get 17 players on the practice squad, and basically those international players are basically exempt. They don't count towards the roster or the practice squad. And, I don't know if you're really allowed to bring those guys up to your roster yet, from the practice squad. I don't know exactly how that works. I'll do some research on that, but very unlikely that Kenny Ogini is going to see any run this upcoming season, even if he is eligible for that. So you don't necessarily have to shed too many tears for some of the guys that you wanted to see make the 53-man roster, because several of those guys, like a Zion Logue, like a Natron Brooks, Damon Harris, potentially LaCale London, OJ Hilaire, Chris Blair, Carlos Washington, etc., or John Fitzpatrick are probably destined to be practice squad players. So we'll see what happens on that front in the next 24 hours as you guys are listening to this. But then after that point, we're likely to see a couple of roster moves made in the next day or two, whether those are waiver claims or free agent signings for those players that have 4 or more years of experience. We've seen that consistently in the 3 years that Terry Fontenot has been the general manager. The Falcons have made 1 or 2 moves, following on the heels of those initial cuts. Last year, that was picking up a new swing tackle in Isaiah Prince. Obviously, Isaiah Prince then wound up getting cut a month later at the end of September and was being replaced by Storm Norton. And he, remains the Falcons swing tackle. The previous year in 2022, the Falcons picked up Matt Dickerson and Chuma Edoga. You may recall Chuma Edoga, who wound up starting a game at left guard later that season. Dickerson, was there. He existed, right? He was a guy that, I think played for Dean Pease in Tennessee, that we kind of identified during the summer as probably a guy that they would pick up to shore up their D tackle depth. Don't think that's going to be an issue right now, given where the roster is at the D tackle depth. Say what you will about Terry Fontenot, but he has definitely invested a lot of resources into that interior D line for the better. And then the previous year, it was another offensive lineman, Kobe Gossett, who was also with the team in 2022 as well. And then Wayne Gallman, right? That Kobe Gossett pickup. You guys may recall, like, I was sitting here going, like, we should start Kobe Gossett instead of Jalen Mayfield, but because reasons, draft pick and whatnot, the Falcons wound up starting Jalen Mayfield that entire season. And Wayne Gallman, it took him a month to get up to speed in the offense. And then I think he played in that Dallas game and then really didn't do a whole lot else the rest of that season, in part due to the emergence of Cordero Patterson. But, that goes back to, the whole Cordero Patterson saga of, people like, oh, Arthur Smith fixed Cordero Patterson. It was like, they never planned for Cordero Patterson to be as good as he was. They had optimism that he could be better than what he was, but that was a big reason why they signed Wayne Gallman, because they didn't really trust that Cordero Patterson was going to fulfill the depth roles. And then, of course, we saw, a couple weeks into the season, he was more than what he was cracked up to be. So, and Cordero Patterson remains a Falcons legend and now a potential Steelers legend. So we'll see if we can ruin that legend in week 1. But those is what is next in store for the Falcons over the next day or two. So I do expect a couple of moves, right? But none of those moves that we've seen in the past really sort of changed the landscape of the Falcons seasons, right? You had a couple of guys that might have started a game, got some reps as off the bench or anything like that. But more than likely, I think a lot of people go into these things and be like, oh, we should sign this guy. And like they expect the Falcons to completely overhaul and bring like 6 guys in. The teams that typically do that, the teams that bring in a bunch of guys at the end are usually the rebuilding teams. Like I want to say like Arizona did that a bunch last year. Like they brought in like 6 new guys on the roster. And a big reason for that was because they didn't necessarily have a great roster. And I want to say like the Raiders did that one year, but I can't think of. There was another team that brought in like 5 new guys off of waivers, and that's usually a testament to having a bad roster. And so if you happen to believe, like so many Falcon fans, and I even actually think the Falcons roster is pretty okay. So like if you happen to believe that the roster is pretty solid, then expecting some massive overhaul and the Falcons going after every big name, free agent and waiver claim out there is not particularly realistic. But we'll see what the Falcons wind up doing, maybe this year, because, they feel particularly emboldened by the recent additions of Matt Judon and Justin Simmons. They'll feel a little bit more aggressive to go make one splash that will, have us going, ooh, what's the plan here? But I think more than likely we're going to see the Falcons look for some special teams players, particularly at the wide receiver position. And we'll talk a little bit more about some guys that may be available, particularly a couple of guys that Houston cut today that may be available, and as well as other positions as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So when it comes to some players that we need to keep our eyes on off the waiver wire, there's a couple of guys out there that, to me, I think if I'm predicting if I think the Falcons are going to address a position, I would predict it will be the wide receiver depth, right? With Chris Blair being a guy that a lot of us, myself included, thought would be one of the 6 receivers that the Falcons would keep. They're only keeping 5 on the roster. I think there's room for an opportunity. We've seen the Falcons try to address this position, since Rondale Moore's injury, with the Jakeem Grant signing, and then he got hurt and went on IR, and then the Falcons released him from IR. So there's still an opportunity for the Falcons to bring in another wide receiver. I don't think it's going to be a big splash. A couple people asked me about Kadarius Toney. Again, for the 700th time, you guys can't try to make running backs into wide receivers. It fails every single time, right? And Kadarius Toney, Velus Jones, Rondale Moore, Cordero Patterson, it doesn't work. It's never worked. It will never work. Stop trying to do it. So, don't ask me about Kadarius Toney. But no, I think we might see the Falcons bring in a wide receiver 6 that has some special teams or return skills. A couple of guys that got cut by Houston that we've mentioned a couple of times on the podcast over the last couple of days: Ben Skoranek, Noah Brown, both guys that have special teams coverage ability. Noah Brown was a personal protector for the Cowboys for several years before sort of having a couple of big games with Houston last year. Ben Skoranek played for the Rams for several years, played some fullback for them. He was also a personal protector. And I think both of those guys, with my expectation that Avery Williams will be the personal protector on the punt team. But if not, you could sign one of those guys to be the personal protector, put Avery Williams as a gunner on the punt team. But also, I think even if those guys aren't personal protectors, Skoranek and Brown, that is, then you could put them as one of the wings on the punt coverage team. And that would also prevent Richie Grant, I think, from being that role, because he's basically served in that role a bunch over the last couple of years, even though he's been a starter. So that is something to keep an eye on as well, potentially saving one of your linebackers like Troy Anderson and Nate Landman from having to be part of the coverage units if you have someone like a Skoranek or a Noah Brown that are also very good on special teams coverage. But I also think there's probably the potential that the Falcons could sign someone that has return skills, right? That's really what the Falcons were looking for when Rondale Moore got hurt and bringing in Jakeem Grant. We talked about that on the podcast, I think 2 weeks ago, when they first signed Jakeem Grant, of finding that other return guy to tag team with Avery Williams on the kick return team, since Ray McCloud is the number 3 wide receiver and maybe kept on a pitch count. And so the team may not want to expose him. It'll kind of depend on what NFL teams do in terms of kickoff returns, because there's been a lot of speculation over the last couple of days from a lot of people being like there won't be nearly as many returns on kickoffs this season as it appeared that there was going to be in the preseason. The NFL teams are going to just basically kick touchbacks, and be conservative on the kickoff stuff until they figure out how the new rules work and whether or not they should kick the teams and all these various things. So we'll see. The Falcons maybe not need to have Ray McCloud on the pitch count is basically what I'm sitting here saying, depending on how that goes. But a couple of other guys that are on the radar, Steven Sims. I saw one report that he got cut, but I couldn't find a confirmed report before I recorded this episode. Robert Woods is another player, but he's not really a special teams guy. But Steven Sims took a punt to the house in the playoff game last year against the Ravens, played under Ike Hilliard both in Pittsburgh and Washington when he was a wide receivers coach there. Ike Hilliard, of course, the current Falcons wide receiver coach, and we've seen him bring in guys like Ray McCloud as well as James Washington that he coached previously. Not a wide receiver, but a very productive kick returner in Kene Nwangu. Was cut by the Vikings. He's a running back, one of the fastest running backs in the NFL. And certainly a guy that would add a lot more juice to the offense as on special teams. So, again, I could probably sit here and do a lot of research on, which kick returners and punt returners got cut today or over recent days, but those are just a couple of names to keep an eye on, and we'll see what happens on that. So, I think a lot of people are concerned about the wide receivers 3 spot because of Ray McCloud being an unproven option, which, I understand. I don't think the Falcons are going to be as worried about that because, and maybe I'm biased on this, but I think the team probably has a lot more confidence in Kadero Hodge as an insurance policy, that when you look at sort of what you're ideally wanting at that wide receiver 3 spot, which is, a capable slot receiver that can get open and also block. That's a big part of it. And that's a big reason why Ray McCloud, beat out Rondale Moore for that spot, because Ray McCloud brings a little bit more juice as a run blocker. I wrote about that at the Falcoholic a couple of weeks ago, that if you play for Kyle Shanahan, it's the phrase is no block, no rock. So if you're not going to block in the run game, you're not going to really get opportunities. And Ray McCloud had a hellacious block on a 50 or 60-yard touchdown on Christian McCaffrey in week 1 last year against the Steelers. And then the Rams played the 49ers in week 2, and Raheem Morris, when he was studying the film, noticed that, and I think that's a big reason, in addition to Ike Hilliard, why they have a lot more confidence in Ray McCloud than a lot of fans do. But I think Kadero Hodge gives you an insurance policy because, again, you're looking for a Cooper Kupp type, and outside of Drake London, who's the closest analog the Falcons have to a Cooper Kupp type for that slot receiver role, Kadero Hodge is probably the guy that has the best skill set for that role. And so, I was telling a Locked On Falcons insider today that I would sit here and predict that, it wouldn't shock me at all if Kadero Hodge finishes the season as the team's number 3 wide receiver, right? That I think you give Ray McCloud a month or so, and if he's producing in that wide receiver 3 role, doing some of the gadget stuff that he's very capable of doing, or doing more than just the gadget stuff that he's capable of doing, then, he retains that spot. If not, then you start working in Kadero Hodge into that role. And I know some of you guys are like, why not Casey Washington? And it's like, Casey Washington's a couple of years away, as I've maintained many times on this podcast. We'll see what Casey Washington is a year or two from now, but like the expectation that he's ready to play against NFL corners at this point in time and at this stage is just not realistic, but we'll see on that front. And, as I mentioned to Corey on yesterday's episode, I would love to see this team, upgrade their interior offensive line off of waivers. Couple of names that I made a short list of that did get cut today. Matt Hennessy, right? The Falcons could bring him back. The Eagles did cut him. Antonio Mafi for the Patriots, who played at UCLA. Jesse Davis, the Saints cut him. He played in Miami a couple of years ago, just like Julian Davenport, just like Jared Jones-Smith, just like Isaiah Prince. And that is something that we've noticed a trend, over the years with Sean, what's his name? Sean, I can't remember his name. Hartley, something. Whoever the assistant offensive line coach is, I forget his last name. Sean something. Sean Flaherty, something like that. Anyway, he was an assistant in Miami, and that's part of the reason why the Falcons keep bringing these ex-Dolphin offensive linemen that were on the team back in 2019 and 2020 when Flaherty, I think, when Sean was an offensive assistant for that team. Another name to keep an eye on is Dieter Iserlohn from Houston. Again, a lot of Houston Texans guys that we're talking about. But Iserlohn was a player that I noted last year when we were shopping for a new swing tackle. I was like, this is the guy that I want, right? Because he's a really good outside zone run blocker, has a really high level athleticism in that regard. He was cut by the Texans. I think they tried him at center this summer after last year he was a tackle. But, maybe he has guard versatility or something like that. So a couple other names that were on my watch list that I didn't get around to actually watching this preseason, but that was Josh Ball with the Cowboys, Ja'Tyre Carter with the Bears also cut. I'm sure there was a couple other names that I missed. So we'll see if the Falcons address those positions. I know a lot of people are speculating that they'll bring in a corner. I'm not expecting that. I would be surprised. I think the Falcons are more than content with, the trio of options that they have between Mike Hughes, Clark Phillips, and Antonio Hamilton at that cornerback spot. It goes back to what we talked about before. It's like, if they wanted a corner, they would have brought in a corner before, but we'll see, but we'll see on that front. So I don't expect a corner, but I would think most realistically, I would like to see an offensive lineman, but I'm not holding my breath on that regard, just because, D-Led loves him some Jovaughn Gwyn. This team likes Kyle Hinton for whatever reason. So we'll see on that front. But yeah, I think wide receiver is the position that I would speculate the most that the Falcons will be most likely to sign, bring in a 6 wide receiver. And we'll see on that front. So, speaking of new additions, potential future additions, let's talk a little bit about a past addition where today, Tuesday morning, I dropped my film breakdown of Justin Simmons, the Falcons' most recent free agent pickup, and talked a little bit about what he can bring to the table from a coverage standpoint, his matchup against TJ Hawkinson last year, as well as what he brings as a run defender and tackler. And that dropped for the Locked On Falcons Insiders. If you want to become a Locked On Falcons Insider and get that video for free, if you sign up today, you get a 14-day free trial of becoming a Locked On Falcons Insider. The link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. So hit that link. You'll get a 14-day free trial. If you enjoy the videos, I've done one for Matt Judon. I've done one for Kirk Cousins and the Vikings offense. I've done one with the Rams offense. I did one for every Falcons draft pick, did one for all the free agent pickups back in March, several other quarterbacks in the pre-draft process, extended all 22 reviews. That's all going to be available. If you sign up today, I think you'll be able to get the first extended all 22 review for week 1 free as well, right? Is my math right? Something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe your 15th day will be when that extended all 22 review drops. But so wait till tomorrow to sign up, right? Wait till tomorrow and you'll get that extended week 1 all 22 review later in the week. So you'll get that as part of your free 14-day trial, and then you'll be good, right? And then you can decide, hey, I'm going to keep going with this, and it's $4.99 a month after that point. So check out that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. You too can be a Locked On Falcons insider, get my thoughts on the cuts, I wouldn't say an hour before you heard it on the podcast, or maybe a couple of hours before you see it on the podcast or hear it on the podcast. And so that's part of the other benefit in addition to all the film breakdowns that I do, that you get my immediate reactions. I've already been talking to the Locked On Falcons insiders about some of the key matchups in that week 1 game. So a lot of great content coming your way as a Locked On Falcons insider. And if you're interested in that, sign up. And if you're interested in what else the Locked On Podcast Network has to offer, we have Locked On Fantasy Football, Locked On Sports Atlanta. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.